So I'm going to demand a lot from you, if that's okay. I've got a slideshow of a case study that I want us to think through together. And what we're going to be doing is thinking about heritage justice and about the logics that underpin sort of different forms of justice. Are we starting the timing? I'm going to do, yes, okay. Okay, let's go. So my case study, I'm an anthropologist, I should say. My case study is based in Mali in West Africa. Many of you will be familiar with it. It was a former French colony that gained its independence in 1960. And I did my fieldwork in a place called Djenné, which is Timbuktu's sister city. And that was a year's fieldwork looking at how UNESCO's logic of heritage preservation played out in a case of extreme poverty, and how the problems of daily life played out within the shadow of UNESCO's designation of Djenné as a World Heritage Site. It was declared in 1988. So I want to talk about three things. I want to talk about UNESCO, and then I want to talk about the International Criminal Court, and then I want to talk about how museums play into these same logics that conflate dignity, people, and things. And I just have to say that Wayne did say this is a place for open and difficult conversations, so I hope he meant it. Anyway, so UNESCO, as we all know, UNESCO was founded after the Second World War in this mode of, since wars begin in the minds of men, it is in the minds of men that we must build the defenses of peace. And the idea behind it was, and it was drawing on many French intellectuals, many intellectuals at the time, and it had a very specific form, understanding of what culture was and what dignity was and what humanity was. And what they thought was, if everybody in the world has a stake in our common humanity, then wars will not be repeated. It also presupposes, as you will see, the cognitive unity of mankind, which is important. Originally, it was going to be an educational program, and children all over the world were going to learn the same sort of curriculums, but that never really took off. What took off was their World Heritage project, their World Heritage sites, and this is slightly out of date, but it still holds that the majority of World Heritage sites that UNESCO have declared are in Europe, so it's been criticized as being Eurocentric, male, elitist, and it tends to recognize built architecture and monumental architecture. And there's been many projects since, like the Intangible Heritage Projects, to try and remedy that. But the logic of this, which is important, I think, for today's discussion, is that it humanizes people through outstanding universal value, a shared outstanding universal value, but very much the heritage is in situ. It's in place, as you can see on this map. It also has many other projects. So it's part of this very, very big project of global, rational, scientific Enlightenment thinking. And it does that in many different ways, and this World Heritage Project is one of many. Yeah, the thing that has really caught people's attentions is the material, and I think that's important for museums. Why is the material a site of reckoning, and why is the material turned to in terms of these discussions? So for my purposes, Mali was very, very successful in terms of World Heritage, in part because the ex-president of Mali, Alpha Oumar Konaré, was an archaeologist and also an advisor to UNESCO. So he was part of what we can call a heritage elite, a network of heritage elites who spoke, in Laura Jane Smith's terms, the authorized heritage discourse, could present his country in a way that would appeal to UNESCO. So 4 World Heritage sites and 1 masterpiece of the oral intangible heritage were declared. In case of Djenné, it's also because it is monumental, architectural, and African. So Djenné has become almost, and Timbuktu, very, very important to UNESCO in terms of talking about diversity. As many of you will know, Mali was seized by a coup in 2012, and then there was a destabilization, and then radical Islamists in the north of the country took over Timbuktu and imposed Sharia law on that part of the country. In response, UNESCO came up with a new campaign called Unite for Heritage. And the new campaign, Unite for Heritage, was supposed to be an answer to a conversation started by the radical Islamists. They said, we're destroying stuff, and they would post it online and it would go viral, etc. And then UNESCO come back and say, no, we're going to try and put together this program, Unite for Heritage. And it's very much directed at the millennials, who obviously can only communicate through tweets and things. And it was supposed to very much answer. So when the destructions in Timbuktu happened, one of the radical Islamists who was part of his group, Ansar Deen, said, UNESCO is what? Because it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site that was destroyed. And in response, he said, UNESCO is what? As in, what are you going to do about it? So this is the campaign. And for my purposes, what I find interesting is that Unite for Heritage, under the UNESCO umbrella, bring together armed forces, Interpol, World Customs Organization, museums, leading auction houses, and national governments. So I'm going to criticize this in a second. But it's conceptually brought together here. So it's not just my conception of these things coming together in this Enlightenment thinking about heritage. So this is what you do, millennials. You take a photo of your favorite heritage site or artifact and you tell us why it's important and you post it on Twitter and Facebook, hashtag Unite for Heritage. And here we have some UNESCO officials in Timbuktu uniting for heritage. And this is one of the many that are posted on their website. And here we have many more, their global heritage tweets. I am being rude about it, but for a reason. It's partly because it, in some ways, glosses over many of the kind of structural problems that we've been talking about, the structural violence, and it is slightly, in my view, tokenistic. So now we're going to talk about how the International Criminal Court have dealt with this situation in Mali as well. I warned you I'm going to take you through, this is lots of slides, but I'm going to take you through the case study to then bring back together at the end and talk about how this all fits together. So in 2012 in Mali there was the coup, destabilized the government. Tuareg groups in the north joined forces with radical Islamists to claim the territory of the north as their homeland, Azawad. It was also after the fall of Gaddafi, so lots of the Tuareg soldiers who'd been fighting came and joined the northern forces. The case was referred to the ICC in 2013. And this is Fatou Bensouda, who's the prosecutor of the ICC. And she, interestingly, conflates the destruction of people with the destructions of things. So nestled within murder, mutilation, and other things, we have intentionally directing attacks against protected objects. And this is difficult because a lot of the criticism at the time was saying, well, this prosecution would not have happened without the dehumanizing background. This prosecution of destruction of things only happens because of the destruction and humiliation of people. So the destruction of things included removing this door from a mosque and also destroying tombs of saints. So Timbuktu is known as the city of 333 saints, and people in Timbuktu tend to come from a Sufi tradition where syncretic Islam is practiced, so you will worship at tombs of saints or use amulets or such. So that is forbidden under radical Islamist practices. So they destroyed a door, and this is a tomb of a saint that was also destroyed. And the person who was found, and then they also obviously destroyed people. And the destruction of people was including these courts. And this particular individual had his hand removed, but this is also a social death because he will no longer be able to eat in communion with other people because his right hand has been removed. So Al-Mahdi, who was a school teacher, a Tuareg school teacher who joined the Ansar Deen radical Islamists, was held individually criminally responsible for the destructions in Timbuktu. And interestingly, looked like he was going to plead a sort of multiple ontology, different worldview defense, but in the end didn't. He pleaded guilty. He pleaded guilty and he got a shorter sentence. But also he did a very kind of performative apology. He was swept up in the sand dunes of this movement, and he was sorry and whatever. And that was incredibly important for the ICC because the ICC have not been able to prosecute for destructions in Syria or Afghanistan or Iraq. So they needed to show a precedent. They needed to show that the international community took the destruction of stuff seriously, and just as seriously as the destruction of people. many commentators found this difficult, and they were saying that the destruction of art cannot really be conflated with, cannot be seen as a crime against humanity. So this is a very important philosophical consideration, and probably also maps onto some of the debates we're having about museums today. Is the way we treat objects, can that be seen as a crime against humanity, or is it only the backdrop of dehumanization that makes it so? Al-Mahdi was head of the Brigade des Mœurs, which was the morality police at the time in Timbuktu, and there was also a feeling that they could have held him to account for far greater crimes, alleged crimes, I should say, but he wasn't. So he got 9 years here. I came to the trial last year. He got 9 years and also reparations. So the reparations were set through, let me keep an eye on the time. So they commissioned experts to come together to work out the value of the destruction of the tombs and of the mosque. And they came up with this figure, very specific, $2.7 million. And now there is a big debate about who are the recipients of these damages. So who should get the money? So the cultural practitioners, for example, the people who were attending to, whose responsibility it was to look after the shrines, would be the first maybe tranche of people. But then the logic of the ICC is that everybody is harmed by a crime against humanity. Us in this room, as well as people in Mali, as well as Timbuktu, as well as the people who were regularly praying at this site. So, how do museums come into this? Which they do, in my view. Cultural heritage, as we have seen, I think, over the last few days, is always about the future, in my view. And its nationalistic discourse is about places and things in place that animate UNESCO's logic and the ICC's logic. Alpha Oumar Konaré, who was the ex-president of Mali, who was himself an archaeologist, who worked with archaeologists in Djenné, the Americans, the Macintoshes. He famously said in an interview in 1988, "We're losing our archaeological heritage like our young men because we are too poor to hold on to them." So the idea is that we are, as a nation, unable to support ourselves. And in this way, he's conflating the loss of people with the loss of things with extreme poverty. Objects from the Niger Delta, from Djenné, are on ICOM's red list. These are the terracottas. This is an anthropomorphic figure from Mali. But they are not only there, and this is Samakir, who is a man who works at the cultural mission in Djenné, and he's showing me the archaeological sites. Now, the archaeological sites around Djenné are now protected, which in practice means that local populations can't go there anymore because they're scared of ongoing looting. The problem being that there is almost, from fieldwork and from my own experience of being there, there's almost a myth of a pre-Islamic Islamic rupture. So the idea, if you speak to archaeologists or some archaeologists, is that people in Djenné are no longer interested in their pre-Islamic material culture because they are now Muslim. That's not what I found. When I was talking to people, they had lots and lots of oral histories and stories about going to the archaeological sites and finding objects. And here you have Monsieur Sao showing me a spear. And the arrowhead from that spear was passed to him from his father, and he's going to pass it to his son. And it's used for the annual rabbit hunting festival, Tabaiho, which happens every year, and young men in different parts of the town compete to catch as many rabbits as they can, as fast as they can. Now, another place you find objects from Mali is, unsurprisingly, Sotheby's. So this is just looking over the last few weeks. So this is a Dogon figure from a Dogon door. And this is a Djenné terracotta sold by Sotheby's in 2016 for near $800,000 US. Now, the problem with that, as we probably all know, is that there are objects like this all over the world, and many of them, what I found hard to do was to work out where they were. So when I was in New Orleans, I was at an African Studies Association conference. Imagine my surprise when I went to the New Orleans Museum of Art and found loads of Djenné objects. I thought, oh, that's interesting. How did they get here? And since I sent emails and tried to get in touch with the curators, etc., nothing, no answer whatsoever. And their online presence is incredibly hard to come by unless you come across it indirectly. In this case, this is a big project that was done by people who were doing research on these objects. And just to say that the museum in Jenne remains empty. There's a museum funded by the EU built in 2010, completely empty, no objects whatsoever. So, for my last 5 minutes, an analysis. We all still awake? Yeah, good. So what do we make of all of this, and what do considerations of UNESCO and the ICC do to our thinking about museums? So, display. Salvage discourse. These are these incubators. Do you know about these These are premature babies that were exhibited as part of these different exhibitions in 1896 and in 1897. The point about this is that the babies were saved by being exhibited because the man, Dr. Cooney, did invent an incubator that allowed for premature babies to be saved. But I think that practices of display have moved on, and dignity and thinking about humanity have moved on. So I would say that that is not a defense. Another fundamental problem is that the economic value in a museum is directly proportional to the cultural loss, to the culture of origin. So in the case of Mali, whether or not the mask, the Dogon mask, has been danced, whether it is missed, whether it is authentic in all these ways, is the fundamental problem. And there is obviously a line to that, a dismissal of tourist art. The economic value is created by museums, museum quality, and they have a very difficult relationship with private collectors and auction houses. And I think donations here are important, and we need to think ethically about donations. The other problem is that private collectors and museum curators are also people who give objects to the auction houses to be sold. So in this case, this is an object from an anthropological collection or a personal collection of an anthropologist, art historian, which is then sold at Sotheby's. And my bigger problem with it is that it's sold next to an anthropomorphic terracotta. It's part of the same listings. And that anthropomorphic terracotta was sold for $158,000 US, which is a problem. Another way, and you said you wanted problems, so I'm going for problems. The economic value is created by museums, and it also creates a demand. So the Vallée du Niger exhibition, which was held, I think, here actually, and in France, inadvertently created a spike in looting in Mali because you know, the museum shop and the museum are similar, and people have a desire. And when you create a desire and a love for objects or an appreciation for objects, you create a demand. So, what should we do about it? Archives of welcome. Now, the idea potentially, and we were talking about this yesterday, can objects in museums somehow serve as archives of welcome? They have made the journeys that people, migrants, are now making. I don't see any evidence of that at the moment, but that is possibly a challenge. In this fantastic new paper, just published in Journal of Material Culture, there is a museum in Paris, Le Palais de la Porte Dorée, which was the former colonial museum, which has become a site for struggle for people who are undocumented migrants. And this photograph shows a person who is doing a sleep-in at the museum as a protest against his undocumented state. So in this really well-written paper, I highly recommend it, the Museum of the Colonies has inadvertently become the Museum of Migration against its will. And this is my final slide. Am I on time? Yeah? Good. So here you have, on one hand, the Palais de la Porte Dorée, with all these people who are outside and who are protesting, and then you've got at the Quai Museum, the Picasso Primitif exhibition, in which cleverly it says that Picasso has been undervalued in his relation to ethnographic art. And we really need to think about that. I would argue that we should look at some of the very interesting work coming out of migration studies. For example, Khosravi has this notion of the primitive masculinity, especially embodied in young male Muslim migrants. And what I think the challenge is for museums, and this is, we were talking about cultural capital yesterday, is how do you re-embed the cultural capital that you find in museums such as the Quai Branly? How do you then make that translate into more dignified, more meaningful, and more welcome moments for the young people from whom these, from the communities where these objects were originated? Okay, thank you.